I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for hanging on to what will hopefully not quite be the bitter end of the conference. Much appreciated. So this is a project that I've been noodling around with for a little while. It continues with my interests in gender and transnational history, and I'm starting to work with some new source material that I've found. So I'll start with Braudel. Those of you who might not be familiar, Braudel's a very influential historian / academic, French, member of the Annales School, was very influential, helped get the Annales School to help colonize the American Academy. And he, in his first landmark book, talked about the history of the Mediterranean as being not just one history, but many. And he thought that it was time to give it a history of its own. That was an extremely influential piece of work. This is a map from his book where he's looking at, as all the Annales scholars, he's looking at the longue durée, right? And the sort of expulsions, diaspora migrations, connections between Northern Europe, Southern Europe, etc. And that has inspired many other scholars, such as Chaudhuri, right? And Ian Chambers. I was actually just a couple of days ago, before coming here, I was down in Naples, where I had a chance to meet with Ian Chambers and talk about maybe doing some research presentations there as well. And this, in turn, this school of thought has inspired now a well-established generation of scholars on both sides of the Atlantic who are interested in transnational history, right? History that sort of moves beyond traditional nationalist narratives. That was, the original Braudel's inspiration in the first place, right? Try to get beyond sort of provincial nationalist narratives to something a little bit broader. It is for Americanists, for scholars who do American history, that's particularly in the earlier period. There's been a whole library now of work on the Atlantic world, and I am trying to also sort of bring that into the more modern period as well. So I thought I'd talk a little today about a set of Americans and their encounters, American expatriates, and their encounters with the Mediterranean world. In particular, I'm interested in a set of American expats who were working for Aramco, and they were based in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. They also traveled extensively as part of their experience of living in Dhahran. And those encounters, not just in Dhahran, but also in the broader Mediterranean world, really changed their sense of self, their sense of identity. Some of them came away from these experiences with a sort of heightened commitment to the American identity, but many of them also actually came away with something a little bit more complex, a little more nuanced, a little bit more, dare we say, cosmopolitan in nature. And I'm going to talk in particular about Mary Elizabeth Hartzell. My apologies, I have a picture of her and I could not find it, much as I looked. But Mary Elizabeth Hartzell was she was an American. She worked in Dhahran from 1952 to 1964. She was a reference librarian in their government affairs department. She was a really, in some ways, an unusual and interesting American to be looking at. The fact that she was from Seattle originally in 1952, she flies to Saudi Arabia, where she finds herself really sort of struggling. There's an interesting sort of feminist narrative here as well too. Aramco had established a very paternalistic sort of setup in Tehran. She really bristled at the way that men and women were separated. She bristled in particular at the limitations that were put on women in these in settings like this and what they could and could not do. Everything from women who were married got preferential treatment and single-family homes. I'll show you a picture of one of those in a second. Unattached women, like Mary Elizabeth Hartzell, regardless of their station within the company, they were all housed in dorms together, and so she was unaccustomed to having roommates. So she worked in, again, from 52 to 64. This is actually just a random picture of an Aramco facility, which I grabbed off the web. It was related to a story. Aramco, actually, if you don't know, was the subject of the biggest hack probably that we've seen in 2012 or 2013. And here's a picture of one of these, the family residence. This is from 1949. What's really interesting, or one of the things that's interesting about Tehran, right, is so it's a purpose-built city in the middle of the desert, which Aramco established for expats. They had a very strict social hierarchy. Expats lived within Tehran. The locals who performed most of the service-related work, they lived outside of the borders of the city, of the town. It was purpose-built, and there's an interesting environmental piece to this as well, right? So Aramco, rather than trying to build a community that would have looked like a local community, they modeled it after, I mean, it was set up like a Levittown, kind of, right? And it followed that kind of like a street line. That required them to put deep wells into the ground to access water. They maintained lawns. I mean, it's a bizarre sort of, if you think about the setting, right? I mean, they set it up like a Levittown kind of, which also tells you something about the enormous amount of, the carbon footprint that they were creating as they were doing this. So Hartzell, again, so she finds herself in this new setting. She's overseas. She is bristling a bit at the limitations that are being put upon her by this corporation. She takes comfort in a cosmopolitan culture that she finds there. That includes things like, so one of her first experiences she describes being there. She's there on the 4th of July, as it so happens. The 4th of July in the United States is Independence Day. Much of the rest of the world doesn't celebrate that holiday, so she finds some other expats. They invite her over to their place, and they pass the time by, amongst other things. One of the young men at the party grabs a couple of issues of Vogue and Harper's and starts reading the fashion and the perfume ads in a very straight sort of, Shakespearean sort of intonation, which Hartzell finds, which everyone at the party finds very amusing. So there's this kind of ambivalence, right, or sort of they're mocking their own culture or their own haute couture in a sense. Despite this, right, despite moments of this kind of ambivalence or self-referential treatment regarding consumer culture, Hartzell and her compatriots engage in some really zealous consumer culture, conspicuous consumption. They're ordering fine china from other parts of the world, which they are then having shipped to them in Tehran as they are preparing then to go back home after their tours are over. They then pack that all up and have it shipped back to the US. It's really quite, and this is all, she had a long set of correspondence with her family back in Seattle, which is how, and so she's got long, inventories of like, yeah, I went to London and I got this china and I've been here, and then I went to Damascus and I got this. There were also, she took comfort in the intellectual community that arose there in Tehran. She was part of this government relations program, and so there were scientists, there were researchers coming from across the world, geologists, sociologists, economists. It was engineers too. It was a really, it was an exciting, stimulating place to work. And so she adopted a very cosmopolitan kind of view in which she was, viewed herself as being, she was American, but also maybe not quite, you know, American. She also, I mean, elsewhere in her correspondence talks about, she looks at Vogue as sort of a prelude to a shopping expedition. So there's this kind of ambivalence, right? On the one hand, there's this mocking of the culture, and yet at the same time, a participation in it as well. And they also, part of the experience of living there was that they traveled extensively. Many of the destinations were part of the destinations from the Grand Tour. She went to Italy, including a couple of trips to Florence. She was particularly interested in seeing the sights and obtaining leather goods. Went to Greece, also went to Lebanon prior to 1958. And also Egypt prior to 1956. So these travels were a source of, they became a kind of a form of commerce almost within the subculture of Dhahran, right? They would compare notes about where they had been. They would exchange tips. They would sometimes make plans together. It became a source of comfort, inspiration, and reward. And I think I might also offer to draw some connections to the present, right? I recently, over the summer, taught a study abroad class with some students here in Florence, and as part of that exercise, they prepared a reflective essay in which they were looking for connections, examples of globalization, in Florence, and they really came up with some fascinating observations about themselves, about what the experience of being here meant, right? That they found themselves, became very much conscious of being part of a larger global consumer culture, but also an artistic community that was very welcoming, very cosmopolitan, and very accepting. So, that's sort of where things stand for me at the moment. Thanks very much.
What I'm presenting today is part of an ongoing research I'm dealing with about the role of Allied soldiers of Italian descent during World War II. And today I'm concentrating on movies, or better, on the depiction in American movies of these soldiers, and specifically in the case of movies set in Italy. In a scene of Steven Spielberg's top-viewed war movie Saving Private Ryan, a few soldiers of the platoon led by John Miller, interpreted by Tom Hanks, search within a bag containing dog tags the name of a missing in action GI, James Francis Ryan. In pronouncing the Italian surnames of many killed soldiers, one of Miller's GIs addressed them as Guineas, a derogatory term traditionally applied to Italian Americans. This cynic and inopportune expression indirectly refers to the fact that among the millions of Americans who served in World War II, the number of people of Italian descent was quite sizable. Since soldiers' ethnicity was not registered by the American authorities, official estimates of Italian-American GIs do not exist. I'm referring mainly to people born in the United States in the 20s to parents immigrated from Italy. People who were conscripted to serve in all the European, North African, and Asian battlefields. The scholar Salvatore Lagomina indicates a rough figure of 850,000 of them, more or less. In addition, the historian Thomas Bruscino mentions Italian Americans as one of the most sizable ethnic groups within the American armed forces in World War II. Generally speaking, the experience of these ethnic soldiers has been scantily scrutinized by historians. Specifically, none analyzed their representation in war movies produced by Hollywood, spanning from the years of World War II till the most recent successful productions, such as Saving Private Ryan. This is my task today, as I'm concentrating on the presence of Italian-American GIs in movies, specifically those set in Italy, their ancestral land, so the ancestral land of soldiers. So overall, my research sample is based on 24 movies displaying Italian-American soldiers that include mostly combat films, some motion pictures recounting the Japanese attack to Pearl Harbor, non-combat movies set during World War II or in post-war occupied Germany, no-war movies with flashbacks to the war period, but also TV combat miniseries, like, for instance, The Pacific. Among the war theaters, the European and North Africa are those where Italian-American GIs are more depicted, followed by the Asian. Only six movies are set in North Africa and in Italy, although they are geographically limited to South Italy, so including Sicily, Naples, and Salerno, or rather Central Italy, specifically in the city of Rome and the surroundings of the famous Monte Cassino Abbey, which was destroyed by the Allied bombings during World War II. Hollywood movie production had the main function for describing the American effort in World War II and perpetuating its memory as the Just War, thought to destroy totalitarianism in Europe and Asia. The scholar Deborah Ramsey points out how during the war, each week over 9 million Americans went to the movie theaters, an activity that became a sort of communal viewing experience. Within the genre of war movies, ethnicity is constantly present and sometimes is even utilized to stress the contribution of minorities discriminated in the United States during the years of conflict. It is the case, for instance, of a battalion of Japanese Americans sent to fight to Europe, whose stories is recounted by the 1951 movie Go for Brook. This contribution paradoxically parallels what happened to the majority of Japanese Americans who were held in detention centers under suspicion of loyalty to the Japanese Empire. World War II, as the Just War, is also endorsed through the presence of ethnic soldiers in Quentin Tarantino's psychedelic movie Inglourious Basterds, in which a special unit of Jewish Americans is charged of killing Nazis in Europe and taking their scalps as souvenirs. In Hollywood movies relating to World War II, there is a recurrent representation of the multi-ethnic platoon composed by different ethnicities. According to Richard Slotkin, this group is a sort of microcosm intended to depict the American liberal society all devoted to the goal of defeating fascists. In this sense, the harmonious relationship among ethnicities were mirrors of the American democracy capacity to integrate all differences in a common sense of national belonging. However, the same platoon still attains to traditional stereotypes of the different ethnic groups, such as the drunk Irish, the Italian Latin lover, or the complaining Jew. According to the scholar Janine Basinger, especially in combat films, the platoon is usually made up of a mixture of ethnic and geographical types, and most commonly, among the others, include a Jew and an Italian. In regards of American soldiers of Italian ancestry in my sample, they have been identified by Italian-sounding surnames and Italian somatic traits, such as dark skin or pomaded hairs. In addition, the capacity of speaking Italian or Italian dialects is an additional element that clearly marks ethnicity. This usage of the native language is anyway constantly associated to a full command of English without accent, a capacity that reveals how these young people were born and raised in the United States. Sometimes perfect fluency in English is associated to the utilization of words extracted by Italian dialects, such as, most commonly, capisce, to say understand, or idiomatic expressions such as mamma mia. In surveying all movies, my 24 movies of the sample, is it possible to mark some general features recurring in the depiction of the Italian-American GIs? Especially in the movies produced during World War II and the very early post-war, the Italian-American GI is often a comic figure, or at least an emotive and gesticulating character. Friendly towards his comrades, he's a sort of buffoon group who makes jokes and keeps high morale of the troop. A folkloristic element within the military, he makes his own some traditional Hollywood stereotypes applied to Italians, such as impulsivity, disorder, lack of discipline. In addition, the Italian-American GI may be used to getting drunk, love dancing, and inevitably to be a Latin lover. His particular addiction to sex leads him to have women constantly in his mind. After the 50s, the folkloristic caricature of Italian-American soldiers is less pronunciated, and they might be easily confused with their peers. Ethnicity now is struck more by necklaces carrying, for instance, Catholic crucifix or direct enunciation of an Italian descent. In any case, an Italian ethnicity still comes out from being very braggart, very talkative, and often, again, obsessed by women. Nonetheless, despite their deficiencies, Italian-American GIs are always depicted as virtuous American citizens who fight hard and sacrifice themselves for the country and their comrades. So, in these films, what about Italian-American GIs who fought in Italy? So the core of my research today. Soldiers' memoirs who served in the ancestral land highlight and narrate different emotions about fighting in Italy. Some GIs were scared about the possibility to shoot in battle relatives or friends. Others might point out the inevitability of war to destroy dictatorship in Italy. Some ethnic soldiers could be even annoyed from the excessive friendships reserved to them by the Italian population because we spoiled more or less their being American, their Americanness. Others might be frightened of their own ethnicity because this could lead to retaliation in the event they were captured by fascists. Now, from the sample of 6 movies set in Italy, is it possible to extract some key topics? Specifically, the importance of Americans, of these soldiers, the soldiers' role of cultural bridge between Italy and the United States, their relationship to Italian women, and the importance attributed to the family. During the second half of the 30s and early 40s, Italian Americans who still maintained a strong relationship towards the native country were suspected to be potential agents of Mussolini's overseas. After the attack, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, together with Japanese Americans and German Americans were subjected to measures reducing their private liberties, including in some cases internment in detention centers. However, in war movies, Italian American GIs fully show their Americanism and loyalty to the land of adoption of their parents, so the country where these soldiers were born and raised. In this sense, against the backdrop of accusations, they embodied the strong patriotism of the Italian communities which endorsed the American war effort by any means, an Americanism that is very evident in soldiers' memoirs as well. In all movies set in Italy, Italian-American characters speak fluently English without accent and internalize the American values of discipline and composure. The Italian-American protagonist of A Bell for Adano, a movie taken from a novel with the same title. After the invasion of Sicily, Ioppolo is called to administrate the town of Adano, and in doing it, he sort of exports the value of American democracy by connecting to the needs of average people. In this sense, Ioppolo fully embodies the role of an American soldiers intended as liberators of Italy from fascism. In order to advance upward the peninsula and liberate the country from tyranny, some military mistakes might, however, occur for the Allies. It is what happened to the above-mentioned masterpiece Abbey of Monte Cassino in central Italy that was harshly bombed by the Allies because it was wrongly believed a shelter for Germans. Despite the importance for the Christendom and Italy, the destruction of the Abbey does not provoke any identity crisis for the Italian-American private Dondaro. So Dondaro was a member of platoon employed in central Italy in the movie The Story of G.I. Joe. And together with his comrades, Dondaro cheers for the bombing of the Abbey despite his Italian roots. Fully fledged Americanism of Italian-American GIs cannot be contested, as clearly shown in The Big Red One, set in North Africa and Sicily, a movie of the 80s. In the movie, Italian-American Private Vinci is taunted by another soldier for his ethnicity, but the platoon reacts to this situation. Just have a very short clip, 1 minute, to give you an idea about the reaction of the platoon for a soldier that that analyze Italian ethnicity in derogatory terms.
I understand you're Italian, she. How come they let a wop in this man's army? The wops fight a wop. I think all you'll do is drink Dago Red and sing O Solo Mio. O Solo Mio, la 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 la.
The guy tried to talk badly about Italian ethnicity, and the reaction is what you said, because actually it's not possible to depict negatively someone who has an ethnic ancestry within the American platoon. So, while Americans are seen in these movies as the liberators of Italy from the oppression of fascism, Italian Americans are depicted also as the natural cultural bridge between two populations aimed to reconnect their traditional good relationship after the dark years of Mussolini's regime. Italian American GIs speak Italian or dialect, as in the case of Dondero and Vinci, the guy you just saw, so they can easily familiarize with the local Italian population. In other movies, such as Bel Foradano and The Pigeon That Took Rome, I have a cover right here, dialogues are all played in English, but Italian-American characters are identifiable by the capacity to speak Italian. Language is a medium particularly emotional for Private Tronella, who, in A Walk in the Sun, set in Salerno, in the surroundings of Salerno, Tronella is called to translate the interrogation of two Italian defectors. Shifting from a rigid American-style military discipline, in dialoguing with the Italians, Private Tronella transforms himself and makes his own the typical Italian body, moving and gestures by establishing full empathy towards the soldiers he discovers coming from his father's hometown. Generally, Italian Americans are functionally bringing Italians to the American troops as they are comprehend the local culture. Major Ioppolo, in Bel Foradano, conquers the Adano population by taking part to the Sunday Mass, thus showing his Catholic creed. Later, he also offers his magnanimity by taking a few decisions to improve the local economy and the average living conditions of the population. In addition, the set in Rome film The Pigeon That Took Rome, the Italian-American sergeant Joseph Angelico and his Anglo peer McDowell find a natural liaison with partisan resistance soldier Ciccio Massimo and his family. In this reconnection to the land of ancestry, the encountering with Italian women had a great relevance for Italian-American GIs. According to the scholar Mario Varricchio, around 1/3 of American soldiers who married the wartime Italian women had Italian descent. In this case, often these relationships have the role to fill a sense of loneliness caused by war tragedies. In the story of G.I. Joe, Private Dondero is the sort of traditional Italian Latin lover who, in the course of a battle, finds embedded at home an Italian lady. In a mix of a sort of English and Sicilian language, he seduced her, but behind her request to stay because she felt lonely, he must leave to keep fighting. In A Bel Foradano, Major Ioppolo, a married man in America, has a quasi-affair with a local Italian lady whose fiancé is detained as a prisoner of war somewhere. Their staying together is for both a way to escape loneliness and war. Love is a core theme also in The Pigeon That Took Rome. Sergeant Angelico falls in love with Ciccio's daughter Rosalba, and he asks her to marry despite finding out she's pregnant from another American GI. Angelico is ready to accept a condition because these things happen during warfare. Loneliness and willingness to get married despite the harsh situation imposed by the conflict also recalls the importance of family for Italian-American GIs. According to the scholar Ilaria Serra, in the American cinema, family is one of the most persistent stereotypes associated to the Italian ethnic group in America. While in the pigeon that took Rome Cicio's families for Sergeant Angelico as a sort of substitute for his own family left behind in America, in the big red one, we saw a clip, Private Vinci, thinking, goes immediately to his father when he finds in Sicily a bag full of money in a sort of destroyed house. Family is then a pivot identity component for Private Valentino in To Hell and Back. During the transit from North Africa to Sicily, Valentino talks about Italy as the ancestral land. In order to fulfill the promise made to his mother to take care of the family, once he arrives in Naples, he leaves his comrades, who were actually hanging out, to pay a visit to his relatives in town and bring in some gifts. In this sense, Valentino reproduces on screen the very diffusive practice undertaken by many Italian-American GIs to visit the ancestral towns from where their parents had departed during their stationing in Italy. In conclusion, we might try to pose ourselves the question why we have such a remarkable presence of Italian-American GIs in Hollywood war movies. First, as they were actually in great number in the American forces, they were just too many to be dismissed on screens, probably. Secondly, against the suspicions towards Italians in America for being potentially Mussolini's agents overseas, in reality, Italian Americans fully pledged their loyalty to the United States and even received wide appreciation for their contribution to the world's victory. Italian Americans were also functional for reinstating good relationship with Italy, a country whom US policymakers eventually aspired to place in the Western Bloc after World War II. The scholar Thomas Guglielmo points out how American motion picture and popular literature, in opposition to the view of Germans and Japanese, never depicted Italians as enemies, rather as pitiful and craven soldiers, but also as jovial and good people, as well as supporters of the United States. In this scheme, Italy looked more or less ready to get closer to the Americans in the post-war. In this process of rapprochement, on screens, Italian-American GIs followed this trend and had definitely a mediating role for encountering the Italian society. Last but not least, the folkloristic image of the Italian-American GI, a comic guy always ready to entertain his peers, will be functional to the film narration to smoothen the dramatic tones imposed by the conflict. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking Florence University of the Arts for the opportunity to join this conference and present the preliminary findings of my research, including a different perspective than Professor Mignone's view of the Marshall Plan. The Cold War encouraged the US to define a transatlantic community based on shared democratic values with Western Europe. Within its own bloc, however, Washington paid particular attention to the Mediterranean basin because this theater was both a key strategic region close to the Middle East and its oil fields and the cradle of Western-style democracy. It was no chance that President Harry Truman elaborated his 1947 eponymous doctrine, which long shaped the US approach to the Soviet Union and communism, with specific reference to such Mediterranean countries as Greece and Turkey. Yet, it was Italy which soon became the top priority in the American agenda in the Mediterranean area. The country was home to the most influential Communist Party in the West, and the US was afraid that communism could come to power not only by a coup or an insurrection, but also by legal means at the polls. As a result, Washington intervened repeatedly to curb the communist following among Italian voters during the Cold War. A case in point was the 1948 election for Italy's parliament. The campaign pitted the US-oriented Christian Democrats of Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi against a coalition made up by the Communist and Socialist parties by the name of Popular Democratic Front. The elections were held in the aftermath of Clement Gottwald's communist coup of February 1948 in Czechoslovakia, and in the wake of this early setback in the US containment policy, the Truman administration endeavored to avert a communist takeover in Italy too. For instance, the State Department supported a letter-writing campaign by which American citizens from Italian background advised relatives and friends who were still living in their ancestral country not to cast their ballots for the candidates of the Popular Democratic Front. According to the most conservative estimates, ethnic organizations such as the Order Sons of Italy in America were instrumental in having more than 1 million of such letters sent to Italian voters. This strategy was eventually successful and made a significant contribution to both the communist defeat and the subsequent consolidation of Italy's relations with the US. In 1948, the Truman administration also dangled the Marshall Plan aid before the Italian people in a successful effort to woo voters away from the left-wing coalition and to prevent the communist-dominated Popular Democratic Front from seizing a majority of the seats in parliament and possibly leading the country into the Soviet bloc. 28 years later, in 1976, Washington again attached enormous importance to the outcome of Italy's vote for the parliament, which was to take place on June 20 and June 21st. The local elections of the previous year had marked a significant advance for communism. In 1975, the Communist Party had polled 33% of the ballots cast, as opposed to 35% of the Christian Democrats. In other words, it had come only 2% short of replacing the Christian Democrats as the largest party in the country. Moreover, the combined vote for the Communist and Socialist parties had reached 47%. In 1976, the US hegemony in the northern Mediterranean region appeared to be in trouble. A socialist-inspired cabinet faced a more radical rebellion in the armed forces in Portugal. A unified left was on the apparent verge of rising to power in France, and political uncertainties loomed over Spain after Francisco Franco's 1975 death and the final collapse of his dictatorship. Left-wing forces seemed to be making inroads into Europe's Mediterranean nations, and Italy's 1976 elections posed as great a concern for the US government as their counterpart in 1948. In particular, Washington feared a communist victory, or at least a significant decline in the vote for the Christian Democrats that could cause the establishment of a coalition government with the Communist Party and consequently weaken the US standing in the Mediterranean. The alarm for the success of the Communist Party at the polls was widespread in the US. For instance, on the eve of the elections, the international edition of Time magazine devoted its cover to Enrico Berlinguer, the Secretary General of the Italian Communist Party, under the caption, "The Red Threat." Indeed, advocating the inclusion of members of his own party in the cabinet, Berlinguer devised the idea of a historic compromise, specifically called for the creation of a government of national unity with communists and Christian Democrats to tackle with Italy's economic stagnation, to fight terrorism, and to send back any reactionary drift to a military dictatorship in the manner of Augusto Pinochet's 1973 coup in Chile. Berlinguer's proposal found an interested ear in Aldo Moro, the Christian Democratic Prime Minister, but it was anathema to Washington. In August 1975, Moro tried to bring up the issue of the historic compromise with US President Gerald Ford, playing on the international climate of the detente, but he immediately received a brush-off. Ford bluntly retorted that the fact that Washington was discussing arms limitation with Moscow did not mean that he intended to select Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev as his own running mate for the White House. As Italy's 1976 election drew nearer, Berlinguer stated that the communist government would not pull Italy out of NATO because such a decision would upset the international balance. He also argued that he needed NATO to maintain some autonomy from Moscow and outspokenly added, quote, "I too feel safer being on this side of the fence," unquote. Indeed, in 1975, Berlinguer and the secretaries of the communist parties of France and Spain had elaborated a Euro-communism formula. In their views, Western European countries had to take a democratic road to socialism that excluded revolution and implied independence from the Soviet Union. Berlinguer's words were clearly a commitment to NATO, but they could also be interpreted as a propaganda stunt to reach out to those moderate voters the Communist Party badly needed to become the majority party in Italy. During Italy's 1976 election campaign, both the American ambassador in Rome, John Volpe, and the US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, openly came out against the Communist Party. Specifically, Kissinger threatened to have Italy expelled from NATO in case communist ministers joined the Italian cabinet. In addition, the Ford administration secretly fueled $6 million to the Christian Democrats and their allies for election campaign purposes in a replica of a similar covert operation that Washington had undertaken in 1948. Against this backdrop, a group of US-based American nationals with connections to Italy, the Citizens Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom, also endeavored to mobilize Italian voters against the Communist Party and to make sure that the plurality of the Christian Democrats would be large enough to forestall the historic compromise, let alone a communist takeover of the government by the legal means of the ballot. The establishment of the Citizens Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom in early 1976 resulted from a meeting of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington-based conservative think tank and public policy research institution whose staff included a number of people with ties to the Central Intelligence Agency. The one purpose of the Citizens Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom was to shape the outcome of the parliamentary elections in order to save Italy from communism. Specifically, it relied on Italian Americans and it intended to mobilize them against the Communist Party by means of another letter-writing campaign targeting their relatives and friends in Italy who were eligible to go to the polls. To this end, the Citizens Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom purchased full-page ads in a number of newspapers in eastern states where most Italian Americans lived and endeavored to persuade their readers to lobby the voters they knew in Italy. Connolly planned to involve 25 million Italian Americans in the effort to influence Italy's voting. The Citizens' Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom included a couple of Italian Americans on its board. There was Senator John Pastore of Rhode Island and Jack Valenti, the chairperson of the Motion Picture Association of America and a former aide to President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Yet, contrary to what had happened in 1948, the 1976 call for another anti-communist letter-writing campaign in the Little Italies came primarily from people outside the ethnic community, and very few Italian-American leaders followed suit. Moreover, such appeals usually fell on deaf ears. Remarkably, although the older sons of Italy in America had taken the lead in the 1948 anti-communist drive, it did not participate in the efforts to defeat the Communist Party in 1976, and no mention of Italy's political situation is included in the copious correspondence of this ethnic organization with President Gerald Ford. In addition, the only reference to the letter-writing appeals published in Sons of Italy Times, the mouthpiece of the order, appeared as an ad paid by the Citizens' Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom. Even Connolly himself eventually admitted that his initiative had received, quote, a very modest response in the Little Italies, unquote. In the words of an Italian-American politician from New York, Paul Rao Jr., the Citizens' Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom was only, quote, a publicity stunt, unquote. As New York Magazine further remarked, quote again, no Italian-American organization of acknowledged status involved itself in a significant way in the Italian election, unquote. Indeed, the Older Sons of Italy in America was more interested in raising money for the victims of an earthquake that had struck the region of Friuli a month and a half before the elections on May 7, 1976, leaving roughly 1,000 people dead and almost 1 million people homeless, than concerned with the outcome of Italy's parliamentary elections. Similarly, the Italian-American ethnic press focused on the earthquake and overlooked Italy's electoral politics. According to the New York Times, second and third generation Italian-Americans who made up the bulk of the US population from Italian background by the mid-70s had looser ties to the motherland than their own parents in 1948, and such a generation gap helped dilute their interest in Italy's elections. Yet the attention to the earthquake in Friuli demonstrated that Italian Americans still worried about the events in their ancestral land as late as 1976. Therefore, their failure to mobilize for the defeat of the Communist Party in Italy that year did not result from the breakdown of their connections with their land of their descent. Rather, the demise of Italian Americans' anti-communist militancy was related to the disposal of a means of political warfare that had been made outdated by the benefits Italy had been enjoying in the previous years. Italian Americans' adherence to the anti-communist strategy of the US government in Italy in the early Cold War was primarily a matter of political expediency. Americans of Italian descent wanted to show off their loyalty to the US so that they could legitimize their claims on behalf of Italy when the demands of the ancestral country were in conflict with Washington's course of action in the international arena. Anti-communism and the alleged threat of red takeover in Italy were often means by which Italian Americans pressured the US government into benefiting the land of their origin. In particular, they resorted to these issues to channel US funds into the post-war reconstruction of the country and to repeal the most punitive clauses of the peace treaty that Italy had to sign after her defeat in World War II. For example, in 1948, on the one hand, the Order Sons of Italy in America launched the anti-communist letter-writing campaign and its appeal to its own member foreran the endorsement of this strategy by the US government. On the other hand, the order warned the Truman administration that unless Italy was included among the beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan and Washington committed itself to the return of the city of Trieste to the sovereignty of Rome, the dissatisfaction of the Italian electorate with the policy of the US government would cause a significant number of voters to cast their ballots for the Popular Democratic Front as a form of political retaliation against the US disrespect for Italy's needs. Italian-American ethnic organizations and newspapers also suggested that a revision of the peace treaty would help consolidate the position of Italy within the Western Bloc, strengthen democracy in the country, and undermine the communist appeal to the Italian people by demonstrating the friendship of the US. By the time the 1976 parliamentary elections were held, Italy had fully regained her pre-war status as a Mediterranean regional power. Italy became a member of NATO in 1949, which involved lifting the limitation on rearmament imposed by the peace treaty. Trieste was returned to the Italian rule in 1954. Italy was also allowed to join the United Nations in 1955, which put an end to her marginalization in the international community because of her defeat in World War II. Inclusion in the Marshall Plan was instrumental to the so-called economic miracle of the late 50s and early 60s that turned Italy into a leading industrialized nation. Following US pressures on France, the Italian government was even invited to join the first summit of the most industrialized Western countries in Rambouillet in 1975. As Italy improved her pre-war standing, Italian Americans' lobbying activities on behalf of the motherland underwent a decline, so did their resort to the issue of communism to obtain benefits for the ancestral country from Washington and the extent of their involvement in the Cold War strategy of the US government. As a result, most Italian Americans no longer made a point of exploiting anti-communism on the occasion of Italy's 1976 parliamentary elections and did not respond to the appeal of the Citizens' Alliance for Mediterranean Freedom. Thank you for your patience.